Oturumun ikinci konuşması bu kez Danimarka'dan. Profesör Gorm Griesen, Kopenhag Üniversite Hastanesi'nden. Özellikle ilgi alanları, çok sayıda gene yayını var ve ilgi alanları preterm beyni ile ilgili hasar, monitorizasyon, gene serebral kan akımı, serebral oksijenizasyon, doğum öncesi ve sonrası büyüme ve de bugün de anlatacağı gibi izlem çalışmaları. Ayrıca medikal araştırıcılarda da çok uzun süre etik komitelerde de çalışmış. So, our second speaker in this session is Dr. Griesen from Denmark, from Copenhagen University. He is professor at the University of Copenhagen, and his specialty is about brain and preterm babies and follow-up studies. And that I welcome him to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I'm honored. I come from a small country. You will see up there. There's a big island near the North Pole. This is Greenland. Only 40,000 people there. In the springtime, it's nice. A lot of coast, some small cities. This is Copenhagen, and you see lots of bikes. Even in bad weather, we'll be biking. And the population, you can see, is only 5 million people. So this is just a third of Istanbul. But I'm going to present you some data because we have a universal civil registration number system, so we have a number for every citizen. And lots of our all our healthcare, almost all our healthcare, nearly all our education is public. And that means that data is reported, so we are able to link these different outcomes, and that is what I'm going to discuss. So this will be national cohorts, what happens to preterm infants, and obviously when you think of what happens to a preterm infant, you will first think of brain injury, cerebral palsy, and this is a result of a national cohort. This was all babies in Denmark, less than 1,000 grams at birth or less than 28 weeks. And they were followed up at 5 years with a follow-up rate of 95%. And you see that the cerebral palsy problem, 9%. You know that. Well, the green circle represents the cerebral palsy. About 10%, I think. That's about what you expect. But what is also very clear is that we have in numerical terms, a larger problem with low IQ. These infants were tested by a full-scale IQ, and we had a group of controls, so we could do a precise estimation on what a 5-year-old Danish child with a normal birth, with a normal birth weight, with a normal with otherwise normal, how would they score? And we then said the low IQ, that is less than 2 standard deviations. So this is 2 standard deviations is our normal sort of range of normality, so we will only expect a few percent. Yeah, this doesn't work well. Yeah, so the low IQ problem is bigger, and the problem in this is that obviously in a society where you depend on manual work, it's very important if your motor skills are not okay. But in our society, a cognitive problem will maybe an even bigger problem. If you are not able to get to sort of a good level of reading, then you will not be able to take part in quite a bit of neither education nor getting a good job. So this is likely to be even a greater problem. And here you can see that the distribution of the IQ scores in this group, the blue was a reference. These were the term infants born normally. And you see they distribute in a pretty normal distribution, the blue, with an average which was 110. And that also points out that you have to be careful when you do this kind of research, that you have the proper reference, because the normal value is supposed to be 100. But actually, as we administered this test, then the normal child would do 110 on the average. And the yellow one is then the group of extremely low birth, low gestational age infants, and their distribution is shifted towards the left. So a few are very low. Say at an IQ of 50, you may learn to speak, but you will not speak well. You will never learn to any kind of reading, any kind of mathematics. Whereas at the IQ of 80, you will be able to sort of get your basic education, but you certainly will not be able to get into further. And you see the biggest problem actually in that low normal range of -2 to -3 standard deviations. In the extremely low birth weight and low gestational age group, there were even some with 130, some very well-equipped infants. And those of you who have worked for a long time might also have experienced this. I occasionally get contact with survivors from 30 years ago who are now doctors, ophthalmologists, concert pianists, who actually weighed 600 grams at the time. So that is the span. But the problem is that the whole distribution is shifted towards the left. There is an average deficit. This is the only hospital cohort I have data. This is a group of babies less than 1,500 grams to the left, gestation age 30 weeks. They scored 102 on the average, on the IQ score at 4 years, compared to the normal birth weight infant who on that test scored 117. So that was one standard deviation less on the average. And then at 18 years, we had significant school problems in 40% of those with birth weight less than 1,500 grams compared to 17% in the reference group. And when we sort of explored this, we could see that the McCarthy Cognitive Index, or the IQ, actually predicted the school outcome very well. Interestingly, the parents' social group, so that is the parents' education in our terms, was also important, not quite reaching statistical significance. Motor development at 4 years did not predict school outcome. Whereas the birth weight group, the fact that the baby was very low birth weight or normal weight, did not have independent predictive ability. This means once you know the IQ at 4 years, 5 years, then you can sort out which of these babies will get problems in secondary school independent on the birth weight. This is a very important message. I think this has been taken up many places. So many places you do some kind of systematic cognitive screening before school entry in order to know how to address that baby's educational need. Well, this is the first of a small series of national cohort studies, which is now done by registry. As I said, we have a birth registry, which is universal. We have nearly all. You can see we have here the fact is that you have some who are stillborn, then you have a bit of missing data, a few less than 1% of missing data. And then there's an even lower number where the data seem not to fit. There's no reasonable agreement between the birth weight recorded and gestational age recorded, but that tends to show the quality of the data. And then there are some who die, 1% who die before reaching 18 years. And then we have a study cohort of 120,000. And then looking at the risk of not completing basic school, and that is in the 9th grade in Denmark. The risk of not completing depends on gestational age at birth. So if a baby is born at term, then about 10% do not complete basic school. And that may surprise you because we are an affluent country and we have a free schooling, and then yet 10% of children do not complete basic school. But this is due to a number of factors. One factor is that some families move around very much, divorce rate is high, so that the child will attend one school and then another school and then another school, and the fact is that no school can say this child actually completed. Another reason is that we have a few private schools who do not report data at that time. And a third reason is that there's some who are not able to. And this is the focus here, those who are not able to complete basic school. Because you can see this risk increases with lower gestational age. At less than 28 weeks, that risk is nearly 20 to 25%. And you see that the risk increases gradually until perhaps 32 weeks gestation, and then it increases more rapidly when you come closer to extremely preterm birth. And that would fit somehow our expectations, because we know that those moderately preterm infants often are pretty normal and their clinical courses are simple, whereas those who are very small often run into a lot of complication in the neonatal period. In the lower graph, you can see partly the univariate analysis, which means we only account for gestational age. And in the gray line on the lower, you can see this is corrected for parental social status, twin status, intrauterine growth restriction, but also cerebral palsy. And so you can see this is somehow the effect of prematurity as such on school. And here you can see that the effect is reduced, but still quite significant for the very preterm infants, with risk ratio, odds ratio here, which is somewhere between 2 and 3 and perhaps 4 for failing school. And this pattern actually comes quite close to what has been reported for IQ. This is a review article in Acta Pediatrica putting together data from Germany to the right, and then from the Epicure, the large UK trial on the extremely preterm in the blue bars. And you can see that again, from term birth to perhaps 34 weeks, the effect is very limited, but then when you get further on then to the 24, 23, then the effect is massive. This 70 corresponds to -2 standard deviation. That means that the expected IQ of a very tiny baby is actually at the margin of the normal range. And this is very understandable. This is a large study from UK, where they do routine IQ testing at 11 years of age, and then they predict the marks when they leave the A level later on. So on the right side, these are the sub-tests, sub-IQ tests, the verbal, non-verbal, and quantitative. And the numbers, this is a correlation coefficients showing that if you're good at math, you're most likely also good in language. And that is a bit unpleasant, because you think if you're good at something or you're bad at something, you may be good at something else. But when it comes to cognitive ability, then it is unfortunate and unjust that if you have a problem on one side, you likely also have then another. And the same actually goes for the marks at the end of school. You can see if you get good marks in English, this was in the UK, you are likely also to get good marks in math, science, geography, and even French. And the 0.81, which is between, on one side, the intelligence measures, and the other side, the mark measures, that correlation coefficient is also pretty high. Yeah, we recently concluded a new study, a registry-based study, very much the same. You can see all birth from 92 to 98, 400,000 infants, and then again complete failure to complete compulsory school. And you can see you start off with about 10%, and then it is moving on and rising, perhaps a little bit less for the not so preterm, but then we are split up the under 28 weeks, and you can see for the less than 24 weeks, it becomes a dramatic 50% roughly is not completing. And here we had, because during the last years we have also had a systematic registry of educational assistance. So more than 9 hours per week. If a child gets more than 9 hours of extra teaching per week because of that child's needs in school, then that is recorded, and we are comparing this. So the special educational support, regardless whether that is in mainstream school or whether that is in special education school, I will see you have essentially the same relation, a graded response. 3% of the terms, and then rising to 15 and 20% for the extremely preterm. This is important because you can say the extremely preterm obviously has the biggest problem. This is what's in the left column, the attributable risk per 100 children is that 16% more children will need fail to complete compulsory school if they're born before 28 weeks. Interestingly, if you're born at 41 weeks, you will have a slightly lower risk of not completing school. So it's actually a little bit better to be born at 41 weeks than compared to 40 weeks. And that illustrates the power of this approach because we have these very, very large numbers. I don't know if that will have any clinical importance. If you are post-term, so more than 42, you can see you have a slightly increased risk again. The big problems is the very preterm and the extremely preterm. But interesting, when you come look at it from the population side or from the society side, then it is the population attribute, the right-hand column. And there you can see these very small babies, they are not creating a problem to society in sort of the burden of education, because they only constitute 65 per 100,000 children, whereas those who are early term, 37 to 38 weeks, they contribute more than 10 times as much to the educational burden. So if you are to sort of reduce the problem from schools, then we will have to put our attention to the early term birth or the late preterm birth, because there are so much larger numbers. And I think they get very little interest, at least from neonatologists. Yeah, that is schooling. Then we had the chance, and now these babies were born long ago because they were born in the 70s, but that is necessary if you want to know what happens in adulthood. That's the problem of all this kind of research. If you want to know what happens in adulthood, then that cohort has to be born and treated in neonatology many years ago. And that is, you can say, a genuine problem we have in neonatology. If you want to know late outcomes, then we will have either to work on surrogate measures, IQ, for instance, or imaging of the brain, or we will have to work with data from cohorts born long ago. Here we had all Danish babies less than 33 weeks gestation compared to those who were born at term, and there were, in all, they were 1,422. And I think the finding can be summarized that when we look at educational level, and that is divided basic school, skilled, professional, academic, then the basic school only, that is plus 5% in the very low gestational age group compared to the term group. And when we look at income, that is income from work, then it is a 5% difference. So there's a 5% increased risk to be finally in the end, when you're an adult, in the low educational group. So there appears to be quite a compensation happening in society after the primary school. That's a good. And here it is social welfare, that is people who cannot earn their living. And you can see the very preterm has an odds ratio being twice the risk of being on social welfare. The lower line, cerebral palsy, is plus, that's an odds ratio of 23, so that is many, many times more likely. But even in the multivariable model where we sort of accounted for cerebral palsy, it's still a 50% increased risk to be on social welfare. Parents sometimes ask about psychiatry, saying anxiety and all that which is worse. So what is the risk of psychiatric illness? Psychiatric illness also have their origins in the brain, although the influence of brain injury is more uncertain. You can see we have again these large populations, and here are the numbers, the results. Here we defined all psychiatric illness as even a prescription of a psychotropic drug. So if you had a tranquilizer or something for sleeping, or something for low mood or depression, then you'll come in that group. And these are the population aging between 11 and 34 years, and you can see in the reference group, the term group, it is actually 15% having had at any time a prescription of a neurotropic drug, which is, I think, a surprise to many of us. And you see this risk actually increases gradually with low gestation, but not very much. When it comes to major psychiatric illness, that was schizophrenia, bipolar illness, autism, then you can hardly see it. And one of the technical problems is that over that span of years, the survival has increased, and that means particularly the very low gestational age survival has increased, and that means that you have to correct for the different composition of the population, and therefore need a Poisson regression. But the results really come up here. The extremely low birth weight has an odds ratio of, say, slightly less than 2. So a doubling of the risk for major psychiatric illness. And if you compare for the other risk factors, then you can say that if the parent has a psychiatric disorder, that also increases the risk, obviously. And then there are issues about income, parental societal states, small for gestational age. Quality of life. This is by interview. We have done that twice. We did that with a cohort who was born in the early 70s, and you can see on the left side here, this 1971 to 74, at the time where the mortality rate was 60%. The objective quality of life actually in the children who reported themselves to not to have any chronic illness or handicap, in the sort of those who defined themselves as normal, the quality of life was normal. And that was interesting, I think, because we have this idea that although you don't have an objective problem, health problem after preterm birth, you could still have been vulnerable, psychologically vulnerable. We repeated it in a cohort born early in the 80s, where the mortality rate had dropped to 20%. And you can see that the quality of life was unchanged. So our increased efforts to make small and fragile infants survive didn't seem to have a cost when it came to their own self-reported quality of life, which was, I think, comforting. This is on the personality. People differ. We all differ in personality, and the big 5 dimensions of personality is. So the question is: are preterm infants of a different personality? And the 5 great dimensions are neuroticism, more likely to experience anxiety, guilt, anger, depression, self-consciousness, shy. Then there's a dimension called openness, open to low openness, close to experience. You are traditional, conventional. If you are open, you agreeableness. You have an optimistic view on human nature. You tend to believe that most people are honest, decent, and trustworthy. And then conscientiousness. You are hard-working, reliable, workaholic, perfectionist, maybe compulsive. So this is a way we can score each other, and people, psychologists tend to say that this is a robust way of characterizing people. We have constituted 2 cohorts before we sent out questionnaires, and we got them from the civil registry. So you see we have index patients 227, and then we had 68 who did not reply. And then for the control group, we had 206. They were normal born at term. And the index group had a birth weight of 1,200 grams and were just at the bargain of being extremely preterm born. So personality reflected what we already know. We had increased neuroticism, which link up to the risk of psychiatric problems. The difference here highly statistically significant because it's a large study. The quantity, it is like 0.4 standard deviation, so it's a moderate effect in size. And we have this relation also with psychiatric disease because we had that from the registries. But most importantly, it was actually a surprising positive association with prematurity. And I don't know what is your impression from follow-up clinics. I've discussed this with colleagues who have been interested in long-time follow-up, and they have confirmed that that's also their impression, that and this is from Norway, the typical sort of extremely preterm adolescent or young adult survivor actually has a very sort of easy and confident. And that is surprising because on the average he has a lower IQ, and people with lower IQ tend to be less confident because probably they've been exposed. So the explanation may be that people who have grown up as extremely preterm have often been told by their families and by friends that it was fantastic that they are still alive and fantastic that they are doing so well. So they have been supported in the building up of self-confidence. And in a society which is well functioning, obviously to be agreeable is probably an asset because your life will become easier. I'll then briefly say something about something which is not brain. And Bertolt Kolecko already attended to some of this with metabolic disease. Lungs. We published this last year. We have this system. All our pharmacies are linked up because you have compensation for the drugs you buy in a pharmacy, and therefore you have to know how much you've been buying. And that means all prescriptions going through a pharmacy is registered and can be connected to that person. So prescription medicine for asthma. And the blue line is a reference, that's a sort of normal birth. And you can see it's pretty common in the first year of life, nearly 10%, and then it drops to slightly less than 5% and stays pretty stable from young childhood to adolescence to young adulthood. And there's a very dramatic over-prescription or overuse or more use of asthma prescriptions for the groups of preterm. So a very nice dose response. The red one is 32 to 36 weeks. The green one, 28 to 31. And brown one is extremely preterm. But as you see, the problem tends to become less. And when we did a bit of a sophisticated analysis, taking multiple observations into account and also corrected for maternal atopic disease, growth restriction, and also corrected for neonatal respiratory morbidity, again to try to isolate the effect of prematurity per se, I mean only the effect of prematurity, then it seems like this problem simply disappears in late adulthood and in late adolescence and late adulthood. So this is one message, that there is compensatory mechanisms which may take place over a long period of time. And the last data I'll show is a study, again, national study. We had mothers who were born in that age span from 74 to 77 and from 78 to 81, and the reason why we split it was because the birth registry functions slightly different in those two periods. And then we looked at what were the complications of pregnancy. And there are two major complications of pregnancy, and that is diabetes, gestational diabetes, and that is preeclampsia. And gestational, so this is clinical illness. I mean, this is something we actually influence, so this is real illness. And it is also so that gestational diabetes is a predictor of getting diabetes type 2 later on. And if you have preeclampsia, it is a predictor of getting essential hypertension, cardiovascular disease later on. So these are two definite clinical illnesses which predict a more significant problem later on. And our question was, how do they link to birth weight and gestational age? Because we had that data from the mothers. And you see, even though we had populations in the range of 70,000, the numbers get small. On the upper line, you have the risk of gestational diabetes and preeclampsia, the dark gray and the light gray for 40 weeks next to the right, and then increasing prematurity. And then on the lower panel, you have the birth weight by gestational age, so the degree of growth restriction or fetal overgrowth to the right. So for the preeclampsia, you have one relation, and for the gestational diabetes, you have another relation. And when we modeled that, we had here by the risk of gestational diabetes, this U-shaped curve. So if you are overgrown, big for gestational age, then you have a much increased risk of getting gestational diabetes yourself when you get pregnant. And then if you are very growth restricted, then you again also have an increased risk of getting gestational diabetes when you get pregnant yourself. So the optimal, the lowest point actually was being a little bit big for gestational age, which is perhaps surprising. So this is one thing. The other thing is that if you're preterm, then your risk is somewhat increased. So the 30 weeks gestation is the top lines, and the 40 weeks gestation are the, and the dotted and the full term just say that we get the same finding in the two different cohorts. So this is statistically pretty robust. So I think it's the first time that we have split up the effect of growth restriction from the effect of prematurity, and they seem to have independent effects on this. So this is the U shape. It also has to be said that in percent, because this is absolute risk in percent, so it is a small risk. It is certainly not something which should influence our sort of decisions regarding the infants, but it points to a mechanism where we, as Bertolt Kulescu addressed, we may influence by the way we feed. And then finally, now this is risk of preeclampsia, and there's no U-shape. This is simply worse if you are growth restricted. So the cardiovascular aspect, it is a problem of growth restriction. But again, the lower gestational age they tend to be a little bit higher than the normal gestation age. So prematurity is also an independent risk factor for this cardiovascular problem. Again, the absolute risks are low. So, what is it to be an adult preterm? Well, actually, I mean, these risks are small. I mean, so when we I've been able to demonstrate them because we have so large numbers. But I mean, in absolute terms, they are small. So I think it is fair for a large number of preterm infants to sort of be, positive. Tell the parents there are good chances that your child will grow up and be fine. But we have obviously a problem with the extremely preterm, and we always had in neonatology those which barely can make it to survive. They may run into trouble. Thank you.